You ever imagine waking up one morning and realizing your empire, your wealth, your power, is just slipping through your fingers? If you want to see how a nation literally went bankrupt multiple times and almost overnight, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is wild, and it's packed with lessons the world still ignores today. It all began in the 16th century, a time when Spain was the undisputed superpower of the world. The sun never set on its territories. Gold from the New World flowed endlessly into the royal coffers. Cities sparkled with wealth, palaces towered like mountains, and the Spanish crown was the envy of kings across Europe. You could say Spain had it all: military dominance, global trade, and a currency everyone trusted. They were living the dream, or at least, that's what everyone thought. But here's the thing about dreams: they can turn into nightmares faster than you expect. The first cracks appeared quietly, almost invisible. Spain had a habit, some would call it an obsession, with war. Wars against the Dutch, the French, the English, every other kingdom seemed to be on the receiving end of Spain's ambition. The crown believed that their wealth from gold and silver could finance anything: armies, fortresses, lavish feasts, and more palaces than anyone could count. At first, the system seemed unbreakable. Silver from the Americas poured into Spain, and the royal treasury looked full to bursting. Kings spent freely, thinking the next shipment of treasure would cover whatever debt they racked up today. But here's the problem: the gold and silver didn't stay in Spain. Traders, merchants, and governments across Europe were getting richer faster than the Spanish crown. Inflation started creeping in. The coins, once heavy with silver, were being watered down. Every minted coin was worth a little less than the last. And the people noticed. Prices went up, food became more expensive, and Spanish merchants struggled to maintain the empire's domestic economy. Yet the rulers barely cared, because the gold kept flowing in, or so they thought. They assumed power and wealth were infinite, like a magic fountain they could dip into forever. But history doesn't forgive arrogance. Then came the moment when the illusion shattered. Spain had borrowed heavily from European bankers to fund yet another war. The treasury was empty, and the silver from the Americas could no longer cover their debts. In 1557, the first state bankruptcy hit, a shocking reality for the nation that had seemed untouchable. And it wouldn't be the last. Spain defaulted on its debt 4 separate times in the 16th and 17th centuries. Each time, trust in the empire's economy eroded further. Imagine being a Spanish soldier or merchant during that period. You wake up, expecting to buy bread or pay wages with coins you trust, only to realize those coins are nearly worthless. That's exactly what millions experienced. Overnight, the wealth everyone assumed was eternal became a source of panic and chaos. And yet, the crown kept spending. Kings continued funding pointless wars, supporting lavish lifestyles, and indulging in luxuries while the people suffered. The irony: Spain was rich in territory and resources but poor in economic sense. The gold didn't solve structural problems, it masked them. By the 17th century, the empire's decline was undeniable. Trade routes shifted to other nations. The Dutch, the English, and the French grew stronger, seizing control of global commerce Spain once dominated. Cities that had gleamed with wealth became shadows of their former glory. Inflation, debt, and mismanagement had done what no enemy army could: bankrupt a world power from the inside out. It's shocking to think about, but Spain's collapse didn't happen in a single battle. It happened in coins, contracts, and miscalculations. Wealth alone couldn't sustain an empire. Power alone couldn't protect it. The moment they overleveraged, overspent, and underestimated the market, everything started falling apart. So, why tell you this today? Because the lessons are timeless. Even now, governments, companies, and even individuals fall into the same trap, living like the gold will never run out. History screams that confidence without discipline, greed without strategy, and power without planning is a ticking time bomb. In Spain, its bankruptcy didn't just affect the crown. It reshaped the world. It allowed new powers to rise, shifted global trade, and set the stage for centuries of conflict and realignment. One empire's fall became the world's new beginning. So next time you see money flowing endlessly, or hear someone claim their wealth is untouchable, remember Spain. The empire that shined brighter than the sun, only to go bankrupt almost overnight. You think bankruptcies just happen quietly, right? A government prints a little too much money, fails to pay its debts, boom, crisis hits. But Spain's story, it's messy, chaotic, and filled with wars that bled the empire dry. And if you're ready to see just how fast wealth can vanish, make sure to hit that subscribe button before we dive in, because the madness that follows is unbelievable. It all started with ambition. Spain wasn't content being a European powerhouse, it wanted the whole world. Kings dreamed of domination, treasure fleets, and glory on every continent. And for a time, it worked. Armies conquered lands, colonies poured in gold and silver, and Spain's navy seemed unstoppable. People everywhere whispered the same thing: Spain owns the world. But here's the catch: every conquest costs money. And not just a little. Wars are expensive, soldiers need salaries, weapons need forging, ships need building, and supply lines across oceans are brutally costly. At first, the empire relied on the gold from the Americas. That silver seemed endless, mountains of it coming in every year. The treasury felt invincible, but the empire's leaders didn't think long-term. They didn't invest in sustainable trade or diversify their economy. No, they spent lavishly on war after war, often against nations that could fight back just as well, if not better. The Netherlands rebelled, France resisted, England wouldn't back down. Every victory was short-lived, and every defeat drained the coffers. Let's pause for a second. Imagine being a Spanish noble at the time. You walk into a palace dripping with gold, knowing the king is borrowing money to pay for his latest conquest. It feels secure, right? But beneath that glittering surface, debt is piling up faster than the gold itself. Banks across Europe start to notice, and lenders grow wary. That's the beginning of the end. By the late 1500s, Spain's wars reached a tipping point. The rebellion in the Netherlands alone demanded huge military campaigns, lasting decades. Fleet after fleet was sent across the seas, carrying soldiers, cannons, and provisions. Ships sank in storms. Soldiers died from disease, hunger, and battle. Every expedition cost millions, and there was no silver mountain high enough to cover it. And then came the Spanish Armada. You've probably heard the story: a massive fleet meant to crush England in 1588. It was ambitious, terrifying, and a disaster. Storms decimated ships. English tactics crushed the fleet. Thousands of men died, and Spain lost ships it couldn't easily replace. But here's the kicker: they didn't learn from the loss. Within a few years, more fleets, more armies, more borrowing. The empire was caught in a cycle of endless conflict, like a game they could never win. And this is where the real damage happened, not just physically, but economically. The cost of war didn't stay with the crown, it rippled through society. Farmers paid higher taxes to fund the campaigns. Merchants saw trade disrupted because fleets were tied up or destroyed. Inflation spiked because kings minted more coins to cover debts. People lost faith in the currency. And yet, the rulers kept spending, as if silver from the New World was infinite. Think about that. Spain had gold and silver pouring in from the Americas, yet it went bankrupt 4 separate times in the 16th and 17th centuries. 4 times. It wasn't incompetence alone, it was overconfidence, pride, and a dangerous belief that conquest could buy immortality. And while the treasury emptied, rivals grew stronger. The Dutch Republic, fueled by trade and innovation, became a financial powerhouse. England, rising from the Tudor dynasty, built a navy that could challenge Spain anywhere. France expanded its influence, taking advantage of Spain's distracted, debt-ridden state. Each war Spain fought made it weaker in the long run, even when they technically won. By the mid-1600s, the empire's decline was undeniable. Cities once booming with trade and treasure grew quiet. Soldiers went unpaid, merchants refused to lend, nobles grumbled, and ordinary people struggled to survive. The wealth that had made Spain shine like the sun was gone, eaten up by decades of endless wars and reckless spending. Here's the real lesson, and it's brutal. An empire isn't just its armies or its gold. It's its strategy, its planning, and its ability to adapt. Spain had all the treasure in the world, but it couldn't balance ambition with reality. They conquered continents, yet they couldn't conquer debt. They won battles, yet they lost stability. And in the end, no gold, no silver, and no pride could save them. So if you're watching this and thinking about the power of money and strategy, remember this: an empire can fall not because of enemies at its borders, but because of decisions made in the palace. Wars, overconfidence, and unchecked spending can drain even the wealthiest nation overnight. Spain didn't just lose gold, it lost trust, power, and respect. And that's something no army or treasure can buy back. Imagine living in Spain in the 17th century. The streets that once bustled with merchants, markets, and laughter now echo with uncertainty. People whisper about prices going up, taxes skyrocketing, and coins that used to buy bread now barely covering a loaf. And the worst part, the kings and nobles still live in palaces dripping with gold, seemingly untouched by the chaos outside their walls. Spain's story gets darker and even more unbelievable. The empire's bankruptcy wasn't just numbers on a ledger. It was a human crisis. Farmers couldn't pay their taxes because their crops were failing, or worse, being seized to fund wars they'd never benefit from. Merchants who once prospered trading spices, silk, and silver suddenly found their shipments blocked, their goods worthless, and their banks calling in loans they couldn't pay. People lost trust in the currency, and trade, the very lifeblood of any economy, slowed to a trickle. And the social impact, brutal. The lower classes bore the brunt of every financial misstep. Inflation was rampant, food prices soared, ordinary families went hungry while the nobility and royal court feasted in opulent halls. Imagine trying to survive day by day, knowing that your labor and money could vanish at any moment because the king decided to fund another war or palace renovation. The crown tried to stabilize things, of course. They devalued coins, borrowed more from foreign bankers, and even tried reforms. But every measure was like putting a band-aid on a sinking ship. The debt had grown too big, the economy too fragile. Every solution only postponed the inevitable. And the people noticed. Distrust spread, soldiers went unpaid and morale plummeted. Armies that once enforced Spain's will abroad now posed a risk at home, mutinies and desertions became common. Markets stalled because no one trusted the money or the government backing it. And as the empire struggled internally, rivals outside grew stronger, seizing trade routes, colonies, and opportunities Spain had once dominated. Here's where it gets really interesting. While the empire appeared outwardly glorious, internally it was collapsing like a sandcastle against the tide. Nobles argued, merchants cheated, soldiers rebelled, and peasants struggled just to survive. It's almost poetic. Spain was at the peak of power but crumbling from the inside out. The gold they had so proudly collected from the Americas couldn't fix the fundamental problems: mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of foresight. And yet, even as the empire weakened, history shows something fascinating: resilience in pockets. Certain cities adapted, merchants found alternative trade routes. Regions that were once peripheral started to gain influence as central power faltered. But these were small victories in a country that had once been the world's dominant superpower. Spain's collapse reminds us of a harsh truth about power and wealth: having resources isn't enough. It's how you manage them, and how you anticipate the consequences of your decisions. Overspending, overconfidence, and ignoring structural weaknesses are a recipe for disaster, whether it's a 17th century empire or a modern corporation. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was still an empire in name, but the reality was stark. Trade routes lost, silver devalued, army morale shattered, and international reputation damaged beyond repair. The world had changed. England, France, and the Dutch Republic were now the dominant powers. And while Spain's kings still ruled grand palaces, the empire itself was a shadow of its former glory. The financial collapse didn't just destroy wealth, it reshaped society. Ordinary people suffered, social unrest grew, and the economic gap between the rich and the poor widened dramatically. It's a lesson that resonates even today. Money alone cannot save a system built on arrogance, mismanagement, and unsustainable ambition. And that's why the story of Spain is so compelling. It's not just about lost gold or failed kings. It's about humans, their ambition, pride, mistakes, and resilience. It's about how even the most powerful nations can fall when fundamentals are ignored. It's about trust, in currency, in leadership, and in systems, because once that trust disappears, collapse is inevitable. Have you ever seen a giant fall so hard that it changes everything around it? That's exactly what Spain did when its empire went bankrupt, and not just once, but multiple times. We're not just talking about lost gold, we're talking about how a single empire's collapse reshaped Europe, trade, and the balance of power forever. The immediate effects were brutal. Spain's neighbors, once intimidated by its armies and treasure fleets, saw opportunity everywhere. The Dutch Republic, fueled by innovation and trade, expanded rapidly. They weren't content just surviving, they wanted the riches Spain had monopolized for decades. Ships laden with spices, silver, and textiles now sailed under Dutch flags. Trade routes that Spain once controlled were being rerouted, leaving the empire struggling to catch up. England, too, wasn't sitting idle. Queen Elizabeth's navy had already dealt a blow with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but Spain's financial chaos made it even easier for England to assert dominance over the seas. Merchants and investors who once feared Spanish power now eagerly invested in English ventures. Suddenly, Spain's former enemies were thriving while Spain itself limped along. And it wasn't just about trade. Diplomacy shifted, alliances broke, and power balances changed. Nations that had once bowed to Spain's influence now challenged it at every turn. The empire's bankruptcy had a ripple effect. Wars Spain could have avoided became inevitable because they no longer had the economic strength to negotiate from a position of power. Every coin that devalued, every loan defaulted, weakened their diplomatic hand. But the social consequences inside Spain were even more shocking. Ordinary people bore the brunt of these decisions. Farmers saw their lands seized or overtaxed to fund failed wars. Merchants went bankrupt as trade routes dried up or were seized by rivals. Inflation made basic necessities unaffordable, while the rich and powerful clung to what little remained of their fortune. Distrust spread like wildfire. Families hoarded wealth. People questioned the crown's leadership openly, a dangerous thought in an era of strict hierarchy and royal authority. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, pockets of resilience emerged. Some regions adapted, trading independently or finding alternative markets. Certain merchants innovated, creating networks that bypassed traditional Spanish routes. Even as the empire faltered, human ingenuity refused to disappear. It's ironic, the collapse that seemed total actually sparked new opportunities for those willing to adapt. History also shows that Spain's bankruptcy didn't just hurt Spain, it shifted the global order. The rise of the Dutch and the English reshaped trade patterns permanently. Colonies that had been under Spanish influence now fell under new management, and global commerce entered a new era of competition and expansion. What was once a single dominant power became part of a more complex, multipolar world, all because of mismanaged wealth and unchecked ambition. Here's a critical lesson: the empire didn't collapse from external enemies alone. No, the real collapse came from within, a combination of overconfidence, overspending, and reliance on a finite resource, silver and gold from the Americas. They believed money could buy loyalty, security, and power. But money without strategy, discipline, and foresight is a fragile thing. Once the gold was gone and trust eroded, the empire fell like a house of cards. And the ripple effects continued for centuries. Spain's financial mismanagement taught other nations what to avoid, even as new powers learned how to exploit the vacuum left behind. It also showed the dangers of over-centralizing wealth and ignoring the needs of ordinary citizens. When rulers focus only on grandeur and conquest, the foundations crumble, and history proves that collapse can happen faster than anyone expects. So, when you look at Spain in the 17th century, it's tempting to see it as just a cautionary tale. But it's more than that. It's a story of human ambition, pride, and the relentless consequences of ignoring reality. It's about how wealth alone can't sustain power, how strategy matters more than gold, and how even the mightiest empires are vulnerable when they forget the rules of economics and governance. Have you ever wondered what happens after a giant falls? Not just the immediate chaos, but the long-term ripple effects that shape the world for centuries. That's exactly what happened after Spain's empire went bankrupt. Spain's bankruptcy wasn't just a short-term crisis. It left scars that lasted for generations. Economically, the empire never fully recovered its former glory. Cities that once thrived on trade and treasure became shadows of their former selves. Silver flowed less freely, trade networks shifted, and innovation slowed because money was tied up in debt and mismanagement. Other nations, like the Dutch Republic and England, swooped in to fill the void, taking control of trade routes, colonies, and global influence. Spain, once the dominant superpower, had to watch as its rivals thrived where it had stumbled. And it wasn't only about trade or money. Politically, Spain's bankruptcy weakened its authority. Countries that once bowed to Spanish influence now challenged it openly. Diplomacy became a tool of survival rather than dominance. The monarchy's power, previously unquestioned, was now constantly scrutinized. Nobles and local rulers gained more influence, while the central government struggled to enforce its will. Trust, the invisible currency of any empire, had eroded completely. Without trust, power is nothing. Socially, the consequences were devastating. Ordinary people bore the brunt of decades of mismanagement. Farmers lost lands to taxes or debt, merchants saw fortunes vanish as trade faltered, and soldiers often went unpaid. Generations grew up in a society where the wealth and power of the monarchy existed only in palaces, far from the struggles of everyday life. Discontent simmered, occasionally boiling over into revolts and protests. Spain's internal cohesion was weakened, making it harder to recover or defend itself against external threats. Yet, even in collapse, there were lessons and opportunities. The empire's bankruptcy created a vacuum that allowed other powers to rise. The Dutch, innovative and mercantile-minded, became leaders in global trade. England's navy and economic systems flourished. France expanded its influence. The collapse of one giant gave birth to a new era of multipolar power. The world was no longer dominated by a single empire. And here's the most fascinating part. Spain's experience became a blueprint, a cautionary tale for centuries. Governments and rulers learned, often the hard way, that money alone cannot sustain power. Overspending, reliance on borrowed wealth, and ignoring structural economic problems are paths to ruin. Spain showed the world that gold and silver are not infinite, and that an empire's strength depends on discipline, foresight, and trust as much as on conquest or treasure. Culturally, the impact was profound. Spain's art, architecture, and literature still shine as symbols of its past glory, but they also serve as reminders of excess and mismanagement. The lavish palaces, ornate churches, and sprawling cities tell a story of wealth and ambition, and a warning of what happens when ambition isn't balanced by strategy. Spain's story became a legend, inspiring both awe and caution in equal measure. Even today, the lessons are relevant. Nations, corporations, and even individuals repeat the same mistakes. Overconfidence, overspending, and ignoring the fundamentals of finance and governance can destroy what seems untouchable. Spain's bankruptcy is proof that no matter how powerful or wealthy you are, collapse can arrive swiftly when discipline is abandoned. And that's what makes this story so compelling. It's more than history, it's a mirror for modern times. The same principles that sank Spain can be seen in failing companies, mismanaged economies, and even personal finances. Wealth, power, and confidence are fragile when they aren't managed wisely. Spain's empire went bankrupt multiple times, yet its lessons continued to teach us the value of planning, foresight, and respect for the limits of resources. So, as you think about Spain's story, remember this: empires don't fall because of a single mistake. They collapse because of repeated miscalculations, overconfidence, and the erosion of trust. The Spanish Empire's bankruptcy changed the world forever, shifting power, trade, and influence to nations that were prepared to adapt. It's a story of ambition, failure, and the relentless consequences of ignoring reality. You might be thinking, okay, Spain went bankrupt hundreds of years ago, but what does that have to do with me today? Well, more than you might imagine, because understanding history isn't just about the past, it's about learning how to avoid the same mistakes in the future. Spain's empire was dazzling at its peak. Gold, silver, colonies, and military power stretched across the globe. But the collapse wasn't caused by a sudden enemy invasion or an unexpected disaster. It was caused by poor financial planning, over-reliance on finite resources, and a failure to adapt. And here's the kicker: these same mistakes are still being repeated today, in ways both big and small. Let's start with governments. Countries today still borrow money to fund ambitions that outpace their actual resources. They spend on projects, wars, and social programs without ensuring sustainable income streams. Debt grows, inflation rises, and confidence in the currency erodes, very similar to what Spain experienced. Investors start losing trust, markets fluctuate, and suddenly, a nation that seemed untouchable is facing economic turmoil. The pattern hasn't changed, only the scale and the tools have. Now, think about corporations. Big companies that rise too fast without managing cash flow, overextending themselves into risky ventures, or ignoring structural weaknesses often collapse spectacularly. The parallels with Spain are uncanny. Businesses that ignore fundamentals, relying only on hype, borrowed money, or perceived power, are like an empire building palaces while its markets crumble. One misstep can lead to bankruptcy, layoffs, and reputational ruin, just like the Spanish crown learned the hard way. Even at the personal level, Spain's story is relevant. Overspending, ignoring debts, relying on easy money, or assuming wealth will always keep flowing can be catastrophic. Inflation, loans, and poor financial decisions can destroy personal wealth faster than most people realize. And just like Spain, confidence without strategy leads to disaster. It's a harsh but crucial lesson. Money alone can't protect you, you have to manage it wisely, plan for risk, and think long-term. Here's another fascinating point. Spain's bankruptcy created opportunities for others. The Dutch Republic, England, and France thrived because they adapted faster, innovated, and avoided the mistakes Spain made. That's a principle that applies everywhere, whether you're running a business, investing, or managing your personal finances. When one giant falters, the prepared and adaptable can rise. It's a pattern repeated throughout history. Collapse isn't always the end, it's a chance for others to grow stronger. And that's the mindset you should take away from this story. Spain's empire may have dazzled the world, but its collapse wasn't due to lack of wealth or power. It was due to overconfidence, mismanagement, and failure to adapt to changing circumstances. That's the timeless lesson. No matter how big or rich or powerful you are, if your foundation is weak, collapse is inevitable. The modern world is full of Spanish empires, countries with massive debt, companies chasing unsustainable growth, and individuals overleveraging themselves financially. The difference between success and failure often comes down to discipline, foresight, and adaptability, lessons Spain learned too late. And here's the exciting part: understanding history gives you an advantage. You can see the patterns before they happen. You can avoid the mistakes of empires long gone. You can make smarter financial decisions, whether for your business, investments, or personal wealth. You don't have to wait for collapse to strike. You can plan, adapt, and thrive. So the next time you hear about economic crises, bankruptcies, or financial chaos, remember Spain. Remember the empire that shone brighter than the sun, only to go bankrupt multiple times because of arrogance, mismanagement, and greed. And most importantly, remember the lessons it teaches us about money, power, and trust, lessons that remain as relevant today as they were over 400 years ago. So here we are, at the final chapter of Spain's epic story, the empire that dazzled the world with gold, silver, and power, and then lost it all. Before we jump in, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. You don't want to miss stories like this, full of drama, history, and lessons you can use in real life. Spain's empire is a perfect example of how even the most powerful nations can fall when wealth and power are mismanaged. At its peak, Spain controlled vast territories, commanded oceans with its navy, and enjoyed treasures that made other countries envious. But all of that, the gold, the palaces, the armies, couldn't protect it from the consequences of poor decisions, overconfidence, and unchecked ambition. The first takeaway is simple: wealth without strategy is fragile. Spain had more gold than most nations could imagine, yet it went bankrupt multiple times because it spent without planning, borrowed recklessly, and relied on finite resources without building sustainable systems. Whether you're managing a business, personal finances, or even a small community project, this lesson applies. Don't assume wealth or resources will last forever. Plan, strategize, and think long-term. The second lesson is about trust and credibility. Spain's repeated bankruptcies didn't just cost money, they destroyed trust. Merchants refused to lend, allies questioned their reliability, and citizens lost faith in the government. Trust is more valuable than gold. Without it, no system, empire, business, or personal brand can survive. Protect your credibility, honor your commitments, and always plan for what happens if things go wrong. Next, let's talk about adaptability. Spain relied too heavily on American silver and past victories, failing to adapt to changing trade patterns and new powers rising on the global stage. Meanwhile, the Dutch and English thrived because they innovated, diversified, and acted quickly when Spain faltered. Adaptability is a superpower. In today's fast-changing world, being able to pivot, innovate, and respond to new challenges separates those who survive from those who collapse. Another crucial takeaway is the danger of overconfidence and arrogance. Spain assumed its wealth and power were invincible. Kings spent lavishly, waged endless wars, and ignored warning signs. Pride can blind even the most successful individuals and institutions. Humility, careful analysis, and a willingness to listen to advice can prevent catastrophic mistakes. And finally, Spain's story teaches us that collapse often starts small and grows quietly. It's rarely one big mistake that destroys an empire, it's a series of compounding errors: overspending, poor management, inflation, war debts, and weak systems. By the time the crisis becomes obvious, it's often too late to stop. This is why proactive planning, monitoring risks, and adjusting strategies early are so important, whether for countries, businesses, or personal wealth. So what does all of this mean for you today? Look at Spain as a mirror. Every nation, corporation, and individual faces challenges that can lead to collapse if ignored. Money, power, and influence are fragile without discipline, foresight, and adaptability. Even when everything seems unstoppable, the foundations matter more than the glitter on the surface. Here's the exciting part. Unlike Spain, you don't have to wait for disaster to strike. You can study history, learn from it, and use those lessons to make smarter decisions. Diversify your income, plan for risks, build trust, adapt quickly, and avoid overconfidence. Spain's mistakes are your roadmap, a warning wrapped in centuries of drama, wealth, and collapse. And that's the beauty of history. It's not just a story of what happened, but a guide for what could happen, and how you can be better prepared. Spain's empire went bankrupt, gold vanished, armies struggled, and trust collapsed. But you have the chance to see these mistakes before they happen and navigate your own path with wisdom, strategy, and resilience. So remember this: wealth alone won't save you. Power alone won't protect you. Trust, discipline, adaptability, and foresight are the true pillars of lasting success. Spain's empire fell because it ignored these pillars. Don't make the same mistake. Learn, adapt, and build your own empire, whether it's your finances, your business, or your personal legacy. And that's the story of Spain, the empire that shined brighter than the sun, only to go bankrupt almost overnight. It's a tale of gold, power, ambition, and the consequences of ignoring the rules of money and trust. If there's one thing you take away from this video, let it be this: wealth and power can disappear faster than you think, but the lessons from history, they last forever. Learn from them, adapt, and make smarter choices in your own life, whether it's your finances, your business, or your future empire. If you enjoyed this journey through history, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind money, power, and empires that rose and fell. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of Spain's collapse shocked you the most? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to see more videos like this, click the notification bell so you never miss a story that's stranger and more shocking than fiction. Remember, empires fall, gold disappears, trust is broken, but the lessons last forever.